What's the craziest crime you or somebody in your family has committed? Story 1. My sister-in-law worked on a ski hill. One week, there was a promotion by a company where they would blow up big inflatables, like the giant gorillas you see in car lots. She had seen them inflate and deflate them for days, so she knew what the deflated ones looked like. One day, she was leaving work, and one of these deflated mascot figures was right behind her car. My sister-in-law had never stolen anything in her entire life. But at that moment, she decided out of the blue that she wanted that inflatable. She plopped it in the back and drove home. When I came to visit a couple of weeks later, she was freaking out about it. She asked me if I wanted it just to get the evidence out of her house. That is the story of how I came to own a 2-story high inflatable cow. Story 2. It's not a bad crime or anything, but it was illegal at the time. So in Germany, up until a few years ago, there was still a general draft for the army. And a generation ago, it was very hard to get out of it. My uncle was a hardcore pacifist, so going to the army wasn't an option for him. But being accepted as a conscientious objector at that time basically required you to be a devout Christian and use the Bible as an argument for why you couldn't harm another person. And my uncle was also an atheist. He couldn't realistically object, didn't want to go to the army, and didn't want to go to jail either. So he waited. He got sent his draft notice, passed the physical, and received a letter telling him to report to X company under Sergeant Y. He wrote back a reply on rose-colored paper scented with perfume about how much he was looking forward to serving under the strong leadership of Y, promising to obey every one of his orders, and that he couldn't wait to experience life in the barracks with so many strong and muscular men. He was declared unfit for service shortly after. Story 3. My dad, when he was much younger and far less responsible, regularly used to drive after drinking with his friends. It was the early 70s, and not many people really cared. To hear him speak about it now, he can't believe how reckless he was. One night, he and his friend were out drinking. They heard there was a party going on at a pub across town and decided to head over. On the way, they passed a large club with a queue of people waiting to go in. My dad decided to show off a bit and pull a skid. He miscalculated, hit a curb, and flipped the car, sliding down the road on its roof. The car stopped, they got out, and ran off to the cheers of the people in the queue. They took the bus back home and immediately called the police to report the car as stolen. The police knew what had happened, but couldn't prove anything. Story 4. My grandfather's father was a mean, abusive, and hateful alcoholic who would come home from working in the mines just long enough to terrorize his children and impregnate his wife, then leave again for mine work. He tried to set the house on fire with his wife and kids, 13 of them inside, twice. One day, my grandfather and a couple of his siblings were picking berries across the road from the house when their drunk father started firing shots at them with a rifle. My grandpa, one brother, and his oldest sister took off running toward the house, agreeing that the first one there would stop him. My grandpa's sister got there first and ended his life. She was never charged with a crime due to her age and the fact that everyone knew my great-grandfather was abusive and dangerous. Story 5. When I was a young teen, the boys from the neighborhood and I loved playing pinball and video games at our local bowling alley. Problem was, we didn't have enough money to enjoy our new addiction. We decided to do something about that little problem. We started with a very rudimentary system. We actually scotch-taped a piece of thread to a quarter and were able to fish it up and down a couple of times before the string would break, or the tape would give out. This worked fairly well, but we wanted and needed more. Our next plan was a little more professional. We somehow concocted a scheme to make quarters. A few lessons in science class had actually stuck, and we realized that we needed something to fool the coin mechanism in the pinball machine into thinking that whatever we used to make our quarters was real. We ended up deciding that lead would be our material of choice. We used lead for a couple of reasons. A couple of the guys' fathers were avid hunters. One of them even reloaded his own shotgun shells. Because of this, he had a burner set up in his shop to melt down lead. Another reason is that lead is not magnetic. Science? We made a mold out of plaster and used the burner to melt lead to make our quarters. But where to get more lead? One of us came up with the brilliant thought that tire weights were made of lead. Carrying screwdrivers and pliers, we scoured the parking lots of shopping centers. We would wander through and drop down out of sight between cars. Using the tools we had brought, we managed to get the tire weights off with little trouble. We were in business. Our production line was soon up and running. We would melt lead, pour it into our mold, cool it, and then move on to finishing our new quarter. The finishing process was crude but effective. We would snip off the burr where the lead was poured. We would then file down the edge, making sure it stayed mostly round. Using steel wool and a polishing cloth, we would then shine the quarters. Now came the trial run. We went to the bowling alley with a few quarters to see if our harebrained scheme would actually work. In they went, and the pinball machine lit up and was ready to be played. Success! We intensified our production, and soon we had bunches of quarters. We were thrilled. We could play video games anytime we wanted. Every day after school, you'd find us at the bowling alley, happily playing our games. But our downfall was soon to come. We never thought about the fact that someone might notice a bunch of fake quarters being used in their video games and pinball machines. It literally never crossed our early teenage minds. We just knew we were having a blast. One fateful day, we went to the bowling alley as usual. We started playing games and soon some men approached us. They started questioning us and accusing us. We were scared to death. One of the guys yelled, "Run!" And we took off as fast as we could. We made it to the doors and down the steps we went. We all lived on the same cul-de-sac, and that's the direction we headed. Running as fast as we could, we briefly split up. The men who were chasing us only followed one of us. He made the colossal mistake of running straight to his house and through the front door. From there, our crime spree ended. A few days later, I was in class when I was called to the office. When I got there, my father was sitting with a man I'd never seen before. He was wearing a black suit with a black tie. I had to go before the principal, my father, and a member of the United States Secret Service. Although they take the counterfeiting of U.S. currency very seriously, they understood that it was just a bunch of misguided kids making quarters to play video games. He actually told me that he was impressed with the quality of the quarters. He also said that they had recovered over $75 in fake quarters. We had made and used over 300 quarters. We had to make restitution for the money, and the charge was placed on our juvenile records. It was explained to us that if we kept our noses clean, the charge would be expunged. Luckily for me, I learned my lesson and stayed on the straight and narrow for the rest of my young adult life. And that, fellow Redditors, is how I was charged with counterfeiting U.S. currency. If that doesn't define the meaning of a wild story, I don't know what would. Story 6. My husband's dad ended the life of the man his then-girlfriend was cheating on him with. He was supposed to serve a life sentence, but got out because of a clerical error. He had been doing manual labor in a local park, and apparently the men who helped were supposed to get reduced sentences. However, he was not supposed to. I think my husband only talked about it once. Also, my husband's half-brother, same father, took the life of his business partner. He might have gotten away with it, but he moved the body when he found out construction was about to begin in that spot. And what were they going to build there? A prison. He's currently serving a life sentence. My husband has never met his half-brother. He also has 2 half-sisters from the same father who are law-abiding citizens. Story 7. My uncle was involved in drug trafficking in Northern California in the 90s. He had a compound out in Gold Country. You had to drive through 3 gates with guards just to get to his house. I never questioned it as a kid. I just enjoyed heading up so I could fish in the stock base pond, which also had snapping turtles as a line of defense. He'd take me out shopping at the mall with a film canister full of coca that he'd take hits from occasionally, shadowed by some bodyguards. One time we were out for a ride in his Corvette, going well over 100 miles per hour, and we got pulled over by highway patrol. He talked his way out of the ticket, told the officer he was showing off for his nephew and got carried away. The officer thought it was hilarious. My uncle later told me it was lucky since he had a ton of illegal weapons and drugs in the trunk and would have fled otherwise. He was arrested when I was 15. It was a full-scale raid. The feds descended on the compound in helicopters and entered with flashbangs. The whole deal. He was arrested, and since he knew that snitching on anyone above him would likely end very badly for him, he took the blame. He was extradited to Lee in Virginia to serve a bit over 10 years. All he asked for while in prison was protein powder. He got incredibly fit, and according to what I heard, once severely beat another inmate with a sock full of quarters for cutting in front of him at the payphone. At some point in my life, all 4 of my uncles on both sides, plus my dad, have spent time in prison for drug-related offenses, but this particular uncle takes the cake. Story 8. My dad got into a bar fight around age 21. Hit a guy so hard he ended his life. He went to prison, of course, but while working along the road, he stopped another prisoner who attacked a guard and tried to escape. My dad was released for that. He never drank after that, and if he got angry, he would just walk out of the house to cool off. He turned 81 a week ago, and he's the nicest, easiest going guy you would ever meet. He never judges anyone. He once said to me, "We all make mistakes." For the record, I only heard the story about 10 years ago from my brother. He told him during a road trip. My dad lived in a small town, and I have no idea what prison he was at or the official reason he was released. But considering it was probably around 61/62, they probably used whatever reason they wanted for his release. Story 9. Mine is incredibly stupid. But looking back, it reminds me of how actually crazy the whole situation was. When I was in the 6th grade, my parents, mom and stepdad, got married and moved me to this very small, very religious, very tight-knit community. My life changed immeasurably that year, and I absolutely hated my new school and all the people in it. Our morning routine was, parents get up at 6, wake me at 6:30, both parents are out the door by 6:45, and I have to catch my bus at 7:15. Well, 11-year-old me figured out that I could just not catch my bus, and since my parents both worked demanding jobs, they wouldn't be home until 3 hours after I usually got home, so they'd never know. The first day I skipped school was easy. By week 2, I realized I'd have to go back for exams, especially the state exam, which determined if you got to move to the next grade, and obviously the school would want to know why I was absent. So I devised a plan where I called the school pretending to be my mother and told them my poor daughter had mono and would be in and out as she felt better. I asked them to please change my contact number to my home phone so I could intercept any calls. And thus began the 6 weeks where I went to school only on days that I had exams. Unbeknownst to me, one of my teachers wrote a note with my report card, that was mailed to our house, saying she was so proud of me for keeping up with my schoolwork despite being sick and out of class so often. I was in 3rd period when I got called to the office to find my vice principal, 2 very, very angry parents, and a truancy officer waiting for me. I had to go to court because I had missed so many days and was given community service as punishment. I was also sent to in-school suspension for the remainder of the year. It's still on my criminal record, although since I was underage when it occurred, the details are sealed, but I was 100% convicted of truancy. Story 10. Last year, my unstable mother burned down my childhood home, where she, my dad, my niece, my sibling, and my sibling's partner lived, because she believed my dad was cheating on her, despite having no evidence. And this was not the first time she had made such accusations without proof. Effectively, she destroyed everything we had built and kept in that home, along with my dad's dog and my sister's cat. The cat was never found and likely perished in the fire, and the dog died of asphyxiation in my niece's room under her bed. Then after the fire, in what I can only see as an act of desperation, she went to my bank and took all the money out of my accounts because she was still listed as a secondary on them. I was in the process of switching banks, but my new bank had yet to finalize the creation of my new account. Moral of the story, take your parents off your bank accounts when you turn 18. She's now serving time in a county jail for the arson after taking a plea deal that gave her a reduced sentence, which I still believe was completely undeserved. She played the poor old lady act to the judge, and he took pity on her when she didn't deserve it. This is the woman who destroyed my self-esteem and made my life miserable ever since I was born. She was toxic and abusive, never told me the truth about anything, and is a greedy, manipulative person. I feel no shame in saying that I do not care about her. She's lost any right to my love and respect. Story 11. I was in middle school, 13th to 14th, and my buddy and I snuck out of the house to go cause mischief. We did this almost every weekend, and we really only snuck out just because we knew we shouldn't be. The worst we ever did was TP our other friend. Other than that, we just rode our bikes around. One time we met up with a couple of girls that my friend knew. We were going around our town and tipped a porta potty, put someone's patio furniture in their tree, stupid stuff like that. My buddy thought he could show off his muscles by pulling a mailbox out of the ground. I said he couldn't, and I was right. To one-up him, I pulled the mailbox right out of the ground, and we laughed like little kids as I set it on the homeowner's front step. Not 10 minutes later, cops rolled around with their spotlight on. They found us, not the mailbox, and brought us home. My dad made me go back to the house and the mailbox was already back in the ground. He made me knock and apologize to the homeowner, who happened to be a 90-year-old woman with cancer. That straightened me up real quick, and I never did stuff like that again. Only later did I find out what I did was a felony, and I didn't feel like living that life anymore. Story 12. So before I was born, my parents were apparently going through some tough financial issues and were facing eviction if they couldn't come up with a certain amount of money by a specific date. My father decided the best way to handle this situation would be to rob a bank. So the story, as I was told, goes like this. My father walked into a small bank with a ski mask on and his hand in his pocket. He went up to a teller and handed her a bag, telling her he was robbing the place, that he had a gun, and exactly how much money he wanted, which turned out to be exactly the amount he needed to avoid eviction. He got the money, apologized to the teller, and then left. He was never caught. The next part of the story is a little strange, and even I have a hard time believing it. But I know my dad, and he's no liar. Apparently, a year or two later, my dad went back to the same bank he had robbed every day until he found the teller he had encountered. He walked up without a mask, handed her an envelope, and immediately left the area. In the envelope was the exact amount of money he had taken, along with a note saying that the money was for her, a gift, and that he was incredibly sorry for scaring her when he had robbed the place. Again, he was never caught. My father is a very honorable man who was raised in poverty on a native reservation. Because of the abuse he went through, both at home and in school, residential schools have a dark history, he vowed that his kids would never have to go through what he did. I truly believe that robbing that bank was a result of that vow, but emotionally hurting that woman at the bank really ate away at him. So he risked getting arrested to try and make it right. Story 13. My Uncle Steve had an ongoing feud with a local cop in Idaho, and one day he stole some blasting caps and dynamite from the mine he worked at and tried to damage the officer's police car. It didn't work, because apparently it was just a greasy paper bag under the car with wires sticking out, and my uncle's friend reported him after the device was discovered and disposed of. My uncle ended up serving somewhere between 5 and 10 years in prison, but on the bright side, that was the event that led to him getting sober and dedicating himself to the program. Now he's over 10 years clean and sober, is in a leadership position at his local AA chapter, and has helped hundreds of people get their lives together since. He's still a difficult and prejudiced person, but you take what positive change you can get. Story 14. My dad was traveling through Tibet in his 20s. I don't know exactly where, but he came across what was evidently a secret Chinese military installation. Being my dad, he decided to take some photos and was somehow spotted. Armed guards, presumably shouting Chinese expletives, started running up the hill toward him. He turned around and ran back over the hill to the road, where he hid himself in an irrigation pipe. He had to stay there for several hours while they drove up and down the road looking for him. Makes me wonder what exactly was in that base, but maybe they just thought he was a spy. Eventually, he paid a passing farmer to hide him in his cart, and he made it to the nearest town. After spending the night in his rented room, he packed up to get on the bus out of there. Small problem. He happened to look out of his window and saw a Chinese soldier standing by the bus. I will always admire this bit of quick thinking. He decided to shave off his, quite big, beard. It evidently worked, because he's here snoring in bed right now and not rotting in whatever the Chinese equivalent of a gulag is. Story 15. In the later half of the 18th century, the French and British used Native Americans to supplement their own forces in the struggle for North America. I have ancestors who had a farm in upstate New York when that was the frontier. The parents were killed by a Huron war party, and their son, who was just a child at the time, was taken by the Hurons and raised as one of their own. Years passed, and a time of relative peace settled between the French-backed Hurons and the British. Word trickled down to York, now Toronto, that there was a young white man running around the woods with indigenous people to the north. The British garrison at Fort York sent an officer and a trooper on an embassy through Huron territory, going from village to investigate. They found the young man, my many times great-grandfather, and persuaded him to come with them back to British territory. He didn't remember his name, so they gave him the first name of the officer and the last name of the trooper for the sake of giving him some identity as an Englishman. Then the American Revolution broke out. The young man joined one of the ranger units the British Army fielded because he knew how to fight in forests and live off the land. Obviously, the British lost the war, but anyone who fought for them was given land in Canada at the end of hostilities. He was granted land on the north shore of Lake Ontario. One of the conditions of getting the free land was that you had to clear a certain portion of it and construct a portion of communal road along one edge of your property in a given amount of time. All the new settlers in the area worked together to get this done, and one older neighbor recognized my many times great-grandfather from when he was a boy. "Your name's not so-and-so, it's such and such. You're the spitting image of your father." "Oh," says my many times great-grandfather. He then wrote to the British authorities, "To whom it may concern, I fought in the most recent war against the Americans. My name is such and such. Here is my former commander's name and address. He will vouch for me. I believe I am entitled to free land. As luck would have it, I own a farm, and the lot behind me is unclaimed. Could I have that one?" And they gave it to him. 200 and some odd years later, the records of that petition and land grant still exist. He used his real name to obtain a second land grant for the same military service. Story 16. My dad has this really strange habit of stealing signs, which has manifested in a bizarre way twice. The first requires a bit of backstory in that his family has lived in our small town since it was founded, and as such, we have a street named after us. My dad insists that because the street sign has his name on it, it's technically his property, so he annually steals it. The second, I'm not even quite sure how he pulled off. You know those giant highway signs that direct you to which lane you need to be in for your exit? Where I'm from, they are huge and green. Somehow this man managed to get one into his shed overnight by himself. This thing could easily weigh close to a ton. I'm honestly impressed. He's also acquired other strange things such as a Ford factory sign, also one of the giant ones, several billboards, bull skulls, commemorative plaques, carousel horses, and a bunch of other miscellaneous items. Whenever he runs out of space, he just builds a new shed. He's also not allowed in Canada, but won't tell me why. Story 17. Back in the mid-90s, I lived in a shared rented house in the north of England with 4 ex-schoolmates. It was a bit of a party house, right next to the bus station, so everyone called in on their way into town for a cup of tea and to hang out, and did the same again on the way out. So it was always packed, lots of acid and mushrooms on weekends, people crashing everywhere. One morning, my girlfriend and I were woken up by the police entering my bedroom. Illegally, they claimed. They pushed the door and it swung open, and telling us all to gather in the front room. I had my rolling box next to the bed. I assumed the police were there for substances, of course, so I hid my stash before heading downstairs. So we're all sat in the lounge, hungover and confused, and the policeman says, "So, who knows about the credit card?" We all just went, "What?" Because it wasn't what we were expecting. Except one of my housemates stood up and said, "No one else knows anything, it's me," and went off with the police. Turns out a bank card had been delivered for a previous tenant, and then shortly after, a new PIN. My housemate had taken it and emptied the account of a bunch of cash. And what had he bought with the stolen money? A gecko in a big fancy glass cabinet. He was struggling to pay rent. We all were, but there was this massive green lizard sitting in our front room, basking in the light. All 6 or so of us just sat and stared at it as he was taken away. Story 18. This one is a bit lighthearted, but I technically may have committed a war crime. I started doing stand-up comedy before my second deployment, and when we shipped out to Afghanistan, I didn't want to lose the momentum I had gained, so I would do shows in the chow hall and ordered a bunch of books about how to succeed at stand-up. One of them suggested practicing crowd work, where you talk to the crowd by asking about their job, where they're from, etc. After a raid, we detained some combatants and had to hold them for a few days before the intelligence team could come pick them up. So during my guard shifts, I'd have an interpreter and I'd ask questions like where they were from and what they did for a living, and then I'd try to make jokes about it. I wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't very funny either. After they were picked up and the intelligence team started questioning them, the detainees said, "We told the other guy." Then my commander got an angry phone call about how I had technically performed unconventional interrogation and was told never to do it again. I haven't done crowd work since. Story 19. My grandmother accidentally caused the death of her second husband when he asked her to shut off the breaker while he did electrical work, but she didn't do it. She later shot her daughter's second husband in the back and claimed self-defense. He was an abusive alcoholic and a former police officer. She received community service. She forgot to buckle in her brother, who had muscular dystrophy and then had a car wreck on her birthday. When he didn't pass away from the crash, she used a rock to hit him in the head. The police found the bloody rock, but for some reason didn't believe the case was strong enough. She later accidentally allowed an elderly patient to drown in the bathtub while working as a home care nurse. The last case I know of, she suffocated another elderly patient with a pillow. She was found incompetent to stand trial after faking senility. That was 10 years ago. She's now 88 and ignores all health restrictions. She's still driving. So many men have proposed to her over the decades. They have no idea how lucky they are she said no. Story 20. When I was around 7, my mom, her boyfriend, and I had just come home. We lived in East St. Louis at the time. I don't recall why my mom was the only one to go in, but she came running out of the house and told us our entertainment system was gone. I guess they had an idea of who it was, because we drove to this spot by the river where they used to hang out. My mom's boyfriend got out and walked over to a group of people. He grabbed one guy in a chokehold from behind and dragged him to the car. They threw him in the back seat with me and we drove off. I don't remember anything at this point. I only know the rest of the story because I heard my mom tell it several times while I was growing up. She has since passed, so I can't ask her anymore. Anyway, from what I heard, they tied him up downstairs and beat him with a baseball bat. I wouldn't put it past them. The man my mom was with was notoriously abusive and had frequent trouble with the law. He burned our house down, nearly severed my mom's finger with bolt cutters, and physically assaulted me numerous times. Much more. But this was one especially chaotic moment I'll never forget. Story 21. My father-in-law hired his son to attempt to kill his second wife. She was shot in the hand, shoulder, and throat with a rifle but survived. This happened several years ago, and they were never prosecuted despite an investigation. They've recently reopened the case, so we're all waiting to see where it goes this time. My best friend has a bunch of wild stories, so I'll pick one at random. One day, he, his wife, and multiple kids were eating dinner at his mother's house when a SWAT team kicked in the door and pointed guns at all of them. They were looking for his wife's brother, and for some reason, thought he would be there. Turns out my friend hates the guy and took serious offense to guns being pointed at his family. He tells SWAT that he'll find him and to wait a second while he grabs some stuff. He goes to his room and returns wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a pump-action 12-gauge, yelling, "Follow me!" This man proceeds to a known drug house, kicks the door off the hinges, walks in, blasts the TV, and demands to know where Dylan is, name change. There are multiple people inside, dealers and users, startled to say the least. One tries to pull a weapon and gets hit with the butt of the shotgun, and my friend fires another round into the empty part of the couch. A girl there claims to know where Dylan is, so he forces her into the car at gunpoint. This happens in full view of SWAT, by the way. The girl directs him to a second drug house. He kicks the door and it proves sturdier, so he blasts it apart and enters a room with weapons drawn on him. He demands to know where Dylan is. Turns out Dylan owes these people money, so they tell him where they think he is, a third drug house. On the way there, kidnapped girl still in the car, he gets a call from Dylan saying he's at that third house and begging not to be hurt. Apparently, word had spread that my friend was on a rampage. At the third house, they shove Dylan out the door and SWAT, still following, arrests him. Apparently, the whole thing amused them greatly, and they were laughing hysterically. They gave no attention to what my friend did to get him. So he drives the girl back, and halfway there, she offers herself to him in exchange for stopping the car. He pulls over, drags her out, and tells her, "I have a wife and kids. You need to get out now." Then he goes home, and no one presses any charges. The next day, he straps on his tool belt and returns to the first two houses, and to everyone's shock, replaces their doors. Story 22. I spent 3 days with a girl from somewhere in Mexico. Met her at a friend's dad's house. She just hung out with us. She didn't speak English, drank our beer, and smoked with us. Eventually, we met up with a bilingual friend who talked to her and learned she had been brought to the U.S. by my friend's dad. His son was one of us. She wanted to be deported and go home. That guy's dad had always been sketchy, but back then, no one really understood the full scope of trafficking issues like we do today. We dropped her off at immigration services. We weren't knowingly doing anything illegal, but we probably would have caught charges if we'd been busted for anything while she was with us. His dad eventually did time for it before it was all over. To be clear, there was no inappropriate activity on our part. It was super tense and weird having her with us. All we knew was we showed up at this guy's house, and he gave us $500 and said, "Take her away from here." I hate to think what might have happened before that. Another situation. I once pulled a guy out of a river who had tried to end his life. I performed CPR. He said his mom was dying in New Orleans, and he couldn't get there in time on foot, so I drove him. 4 hours each way. The next week I saw his picture on the news. He was wanted for murder. I heard they eventually caught him. Back in high school, I drove to Arizona looking for better weed because our area was dry. I don't even know why Arizona. Ended up finding peyote instead and disappeared for a week, just tripping the entire time. There's more, but I won't share them here. All this was back in the 90s, statute of limitations and all that, but it's still better to leave some things in the past. Story 23. I used to be a bipolar ADHD punk who messed her head up with way too many party drugs and hallucinogens far too early in life. One of the more absurd stories happened when I was in a party-centric city. I took 2 pills, no idea what they were, and drank Red Bull with vodka. I got into a fight, got confronted, panicked, stole a parasol from a venue, and was chased through a chaotic part of town by police who had been just across the street. I made it to a little overpass and jumped. I must have decided either to fly or die, and apparently planned it early on, like the genius I am. I woke up the next evening with a femur that had nearly crushed my hip bone when I hit the ground. Insurance flew me home. I laid in bed for a month and was walking somewhat properly a month later. I never got the ticket for the theft charges. I live in constant fear that someday they'll discover it and come after me with fines from hell. Story 24. Was going to say my family's pretty straight, but I just thought of one. My great-grandmother smuggled cameras out of Nazi Germany. This was during the time when Jews could still leave if they got a visa, and she managed to get one to the US. But they were only allowed to take a very strict list of personal possessions, and they had to pack in front of the police and then have the suitcases sealed as approved. She decided to smuggle some cameras out to sell and have some money to live on. So she got the officers drunk and bribed them. All went well. She got on the train with her approved suitcase. But then the country she had to travel through to get to her ship wouldn't let the train through. It was just like when those Syrian refugees got stuck on the way to Germany. There was a whole crisis, and eventually all the refugees were sent back to Germany. She had given away all her worldly possessions, moved out of her house, and had nothing to go back to. But worst of all, her sealed suitcase would be reopened. So instead, she located a distant cousin in the neighboring country and left the suitcase with him. When she eventually managed to get to the US, he shipped the suitcase to her, and the cameras were gone. Some customs agent had stolen them along the way. Before getting her real visa, she also begged and bribed someone at the embassy to get a fake visa to get her husband released from a camp. Early on, when that still worked. Story 25. This was me. A lot of people here are joking, but I want to give a serious answer. I actually committed a crime a few years ago. And before you read this, I just want to say I'm not proud of it. I was young and reckless and running with the wrong crowd. This isn't an excuse. I take full responsibility for what I did. But sometimes when you're young and live in a city with high unemployment and have nothing to do, you get stupid ideas. So one night I decided to, wow, this is still difficult to admit even after all these years, but here we go. I decided to illegally download a song, and in doing so, I greatly damaged the music industry and hurt all those hardworking people in the business. It's shocking, I know. Sometimes I still wake up screaming at night, thinking about what a terrible thing I did. It's a burden I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. Story 26. My grandma and her lover murdered my grandpa. Probably 9 or 10 years later, her lover, now her husband, went on to kill her. After she passed, he remarried and killed that wife too. They suspect he also ended the life of a previous wife, who had passed shortly before my grandpa did. He confessed on his deathbed and even mentioned that they had taken the life of his 90-something-year-old mother as well. My extended family likes to pretend that he made my grandma do it, but he didn't. She went along with it because she wanted out of the marriage. My grandpa was a nasty, abusive kind of man, but she wasn't any better at the end of the day. He was in his 30s when he married her at 17, and they had 6 kids together. At least one of them, my mom, isn't actually his, and there are probably more of his unknown kids out there as well. Grandma died on my 13th birthday, and I used to think that the number 13 was genuinely cursed because of all the superstitions around it. But it was just bad timing. That's all. Story 27. My dad, mom, and I test drove a Nissan when I was a kid, around 6 years old. Back then, you didn't have to have someone accompany you on test drives. And from what my dad said, they didn't even make a copy of your driver's license. Well, we lived in Ohio at the time, and there was a lot of snow on the ground since it was winter. The Nissan they test drove was a 2-seater. My dad was driving, and I was in my mom's lap. My dad wanted to play around, and he did donuts in the snow like usual. Well, this time, the little Nissan was too fast for him to control. So when he did that, he lost control and hit a light pole. My parents and I got out of the car and walked back to the dealership. My mom and I waited a little bit further down the road. My dad got our family car and picked us up. A lot of years went by, and I asked my parents if they ever had to pay for that or deal with a lawsuit. My dad told me, "No, I didn't even go inside the dealership. We just never went back to them again." So I guess I'm sort of an accomplice to wrecking a car and never returning it. Story 28. Was skateboarding with my friend and me. There was a public swimming lake near the park. It was 90 degrees out. I was wearing pants, so I decided to swim in my boxers. There was a dock toward the center of the lake. We swam out to it, I climbed up the ladder onto the dock, and the weight of the water pulled my boxers down a little, so my backside was showing for a moment. Someone must have called the police because of that. At least that's my guess. Cops waved me over to swim to shore. I got to the shore and talked to the cops in just my boxers. They said, "We got a call saying you were dancing around with your private parts exposed on the beach and flashing everyone," which was insane because I had spent all my time on the dock and swimming nearby. Plus, I would never do something like that. So that's what I told the cops. Then one of the cops looked me in the eye and said, "Oh yeah, well, you're exposed right now." I looked down, and sure enough, I was unintentionally exposed through the slit in my boxers. I had talked to the police for the entire conversation without realizing. They then arrested me and wouldn't even let me put clothes on. I was 15 years old. It sucked. Story 29. Wasn't really that bad, more hilarious than anything, but still a crime nonetheless. My grandfather, who I never met, he passed when my dad was a baby, was kind of a good old boy type. He used to drink quite a bit and get up to mischief. From all the stories I heard, it was just that. Mischief. I guess he was a very kind person who would never intentionally hurt anyone. Just liked doing dumb things and having fun. So in the late 60s or early 70s, he went to pick up his buddy from work so they could go drinking. My grandfather showed up in his pickup truck already buzzed. Drinking and driving was sadly common back then. His friend worked at a warehouse department type store. He pulled around back, and there it was, a whole shipment of brand new wooden rocking chairs just sitting there. He filled the back of the truck with them, stole like 8 of them. Apparently, he thought it was hilarious. He then gave them as gifts to various family members. My father and mother still have one of those stolen rocking chairs in their home to this day. Story 30. It's only the craziest because I was so young. As for my dad, he just has a long record of driving under the influence. Me, though? When I was in 2nd grade, I started breaking into houses in my neighborhood and vandalizing them with my friends because we didn't know what for rent meant. We thought they were just empty houses. Around the same time, we also started stealing mail. My mom found out about it and called the cops. She told me I was on house arrest because what I did was serious. And she told me a drone in the sky was watching me at all times and that if I left the yard, they would come and take me to jail. My friend who was doing it with me had a dad who was a correctional officer. I think that's what they're called. He took her with him and made her sit in a classroom and told her it was her jail cell. I ended up doing yard work for an older lady I had stolen silverware from. Her name was Gretchen, and she was the sweetest lady I had ever met. I didn't mind planting flowers and such with her because she was always so nice and fed me. Story 31. My grandma was ruthless to people. She passed away a long time ago, but this story haunts me. She had a neighbor she didn't like because his dog always barked and his trees would grow over into her yard. One day they got into a heated argument, and apparently she pushed him. He pushed her back and she fell. She didn't like that, So she called the cops on him and reportedly said something along the lines that he had assaulted her. The police believed her story, and the neighbor eventually went to prison, had to register as an offender, and had to sell his house since it was near a school. She completely ruined this man's life because she was vindictive and couldn't let things go. I was really little when this happened, and we didn't learn about it until she was near the end of her life. I never had a good relationship with her since she did some awful things to me too. For example, I was a bit chunky in elementary school and asked my mom if I could go to the movies with some friends. A girl I had a crush on was going to be there. My grandma overheard and said straight to my face, "Your fat self doesn't need to sit for 2 hours stuffing your face at the movies." Another fond memory of her is when I had a slightly loose tooth in the front of my mouth. She asked if she could see it. Naive little me opened my mouth and she grabbed the tooth and snapped it off. My mouth was gushing with blood. Respect your elders, right? She also taught me how to swim by pushing me into the middle of a lake without a life vest. Good times. Story 32. My alcoholic cousin got heavily intoxicated at a bar, and they ended up calling the police on her. The officers arrested her and were in the process of cuffing her when a fight broke out nearby. They must have thought she was just a harmless drunk and left her alone to go deal with the fight. She took the opportunity to jump into the squad car and drove away. Then she drove to her ex-boyfriend's house and did donuts on his front lawn with the lights flashing, using the police car PA speaker to loudly insult him. She tore up his yard, his neighbors' yards, and hit several parked cars before driving away and eventually totaling the police car. They caught her soon afterward, and she spent 3 years in jail. When she returned to the small town in southern Illinois, the police chief, or sheriff, literally picked her up, took her to the Greyhound bus station, bought her a ticket out of town, and told her never ever to come back. Story 33. 16,000 comments deep, so probably no one will see this. My mom once dated a truly awful man who was emotionally, physically, and possibly sexually abusive, mostly toward my sister, though I suspect there was at least one instance of forced activity in the relationship. He bought an RV and a truck camper. Both were parked at our house, and only he had the keys. Whenever anyone misbehaved, he would take something important to them and lock it in the camper or RV. We never got the items back. He even did this to my mom. Over a couple of years, those campers became full of our things and who knows what else. We were never allowed in them or near him while he accessed them. From the few glimpses I got, they were packed hoarder style. Eventually, they broke up. He left and took his campers, still full of our belongings, to live on his sister's property. He stalked and harassed us for at least 5 years after that. I think he continued driving by and sneaking into our yard for even longer, though it became less frequent and, sadly, something we got used to. The incident I'm about to share likely happened within the first year of the breakup, when his harassment and threats were the worst. He would show up at my mom's work, call constantly, even run her off the road and spray paint slurs on the house. My mom eventually got a restraining order, but it did very little. One night we came home to find that things were missing, TVs, a camcorder, and more. My mom called the police, but since they had been in a relationship, and even with a restraining order in place, the police said they couldn't do anything about him taking items. That night seemed to be her breaking point. I was a kid, so I went to bed unaware of anything unusual. The next morning, my mom had a severe dog bite on the back of her leg. She told a story about a dog attacking her, but it didn't add up. Later that day, her ex started calling and freaking out, and the police came by. That's when I learned his RVs had caught fire the night before. I didn't press her for answers until many years later, 25 or 30 maybe. Finally, I asked. She told me that after we went to bed, she snuck out of the house and set his RVs on fire. While hiding in the bushes afterward, she accidentally got too close to a dog's den and was bitten on the leg. The dog clamped down and wouldn't let go, so she had to stay perfectly still in the bushes until it released her. She said the thought of him locking up more of her belongings pushed her over the edge. She had tried everything, legal channels, the police, and no one would help, so she burned it all to the ground. If you ask me, that was the one moment of justice we ever got. Story 34. My grandpa had a long rap sheet. The first story I heard about him was from when he joined the Navy. He waited 4 days for his boat, then decided to go home. That night, military police showed up and threw him in prison. The second story, he came home early from work one day. His kids were little, My mom was about 3 years old, and he found her all the way down the long dirt driveway in a dirty diaper. He picked her up, brought her to the house, and found his wife in the woodshed with his best friend. He attacked them both so badly that he was charged with attempted murder and sent to prison. The third thing, he escaped prison with 2 other men. During the escape, they encountered a sheriff. They beat and tied him up. While the others were arguing about what to do next, my grandpa walked over and shot the sheriff in the face with his own gun. The fourth story, he killed someone in prison with a 50-pound weight. Fifth, he robbed a liquor store, though I'm not sure when that happened. All of this was before I was even born. Story 35. My grandfather was a well-connected man from Northern Ireland. He fought in World War II and made friends across Britain, America, Canada, and Germany. When the Troubles began, he used his connections to start smuggling weapons and materials into Ireland. He played both sides, supplying both the IRA in the Republic of Ireland and the UVF in Northern Ireland. He became quite wealthy during the 70s and early 80s, and even bought back our ancestral lands in Ulster from the government. He also gained both Canadian and American citizenship. He made many friends in the IRA and UVF, and regularly visited Gusty Spence in prison. His brother, his son, my father, and his nephew were also involved in the operation. The nephew, however, was loyal only to the UVF and was later convicted of over 9 murders. My grandfather was eventually caught in the mid-80s in Canada. He was charged with aiding international terrorism, international arms smuggling, and having connections to the Brighton Hotel bombing, among other smaller charges. One of his co-conspirators pleaded guilty and gave proof that helped exonerate my grandfather and the others. In the end, my grandfather was only convicted of unlawful possession of a firearm, but was banned from leaving Canada after his sentence. He lost much of the wealth and land he'd accumulated to the British government. He later regained the deeds and gave the land to Spence, who returned it to my aunt in the 2000s. He's since retired with his wife in Ontario. He was recently diagnosed with cancer, but he's not worried. He still sends me $10 for my birthday and Christmas with a handwritten letter. Story 36. In 1970, my dad had a buddy living in Boston, Massachusetts, who wanted to move back home to Ohio, but didn't have a car. So my dad and his friends decided to take a road trip to Boston to pick him up, party for the weekend, and drive back. As they were piling into the car to start their journey, they loaded a couple of cases of beer, and the friend said he had a surprise. He handed each of them a hit of acid and said it would make the trip fly by. A few hours into the drive, they were tripping hard and had each had a couple of beers. Then they got pulled over. The driver pulled over, and everyone in the car started freaking out. They shoved the empty bottles under the seats and covered the cases with jackets and their feet. The officer approached, knocked on the window, and the driver rolled it down. The officer asked if he knew how fast he was going. My dad told me they all looked at each other with huge eyes and went completely silent. He said he was thinking, "Oh no, we must have been doing 100. The scenery has been melting." Finally, the driver said, "No, I don't." The officer looked at each of them, then said, "You were driving 10 miles per hour on a 65 miles per hour highway. Are you having car trouble or what?" The driver politely said, "No, just being extra cautious, you know?" The officer shook his head, told them to speed up or get off the highway, and walked away. As soon as he left, they all burst out laughing and crying. They made it to Boston, picked up their friend, and made it safely back to Ohio, still tripping the entire way. Story 37. Back in the mid to late 90s, during the glorious early days of the internet, there was a thing called the Anarchist Cookbook that showed in detail how to make bombs of all different sizes. My brother and 2 of his friends, in their infinite teenage wisdom, decided to use that to make fertilizer pipe bombs and blow up our neighbor's brick mailbox. Not even a neighbor in another city. It was literally a street over from our own house. Boom! Mailbox blown to pieces, and they got away scot-free. A few weeks later, the neighbor hired some people to rebuild the brick mailbox. This was apparently unacceptable in my brother's mind. So he and his friends went back and blew it up again. The very next day after it was rebuilt. This time, someone saw my brother's car and told the neighbors, which led to a police investigation and an FBI investigation. My brother was the only one in the group who was 18. The others were 17 at the time. I don't recall the exact consequences, but there was a brief stint in jail until they could prove he wasn't a terrorist, just a very dumb teenager. I think the neighbors took pity on his foolishness and didn't press charges. He ended up doing several years of community service, though. And that, ladies and gents, is the story of the second time the FBI showed up at my house. Story 38. In high school, there was a huge inflatable Darth Vader on the roof of a fast food restaurant. I had to work. Otherwise, I would have been part of the shenanigans. A plan was made to park a vehicle in a lot through the woods behind the place, wait for nightfall, and collect the 15-foot inflatable. The first obstacle was the ladder to the roof, but a well-placed screwdriver made quick work of the secure ladder. Next came the solid snake-style crawl to the ropes tying down the Sith Lord. Things were going smoothly until the local cops did a drive-by just as Vader slowly deflated. After nearly panicking, my friends held their breath and watched the police leave, completely unaware. Anakin was then rolled up and thrown off the roof. Once again, he didn't have the high ground. A group of teens each grabbed part of his rolled body and bolted through the woods, into the vehicle and back home. My friend's parents never knew about the monstrosity hiding in his closet for years to come. I'll never forget the newspaper article, and my parents' disbelief that anyone could pull something like that off. Story 39. When I was younger, my mom got involved in heavy drug use. She stopped coming home regularly and basically just left my sisters, my stepdad, and me behind. Eventually, she got a new boyfriend, and one day she, her boyfriend, and a friend went to buy drugs from their dealer. But instead, they ended up robbing him and beating him nearly to death. This man should not have survived. I've seen the photos of his face. It was completely deformed. A few days later, I was home by myself, and a large number of police officers surrounded my house with ARs and everything. They had a warrant for my mom. I was absolutely terrified. I was probably no older than 13 at the time. I'm 22 now. Somehow, she ended up serving no jail time. She's now 3 or 4 years clean and has built a much better relationship with me and my sisters. Her boyfriend is also clean, and surprisingly, he's actually a really decent guy. Story 40. My uncle was a boat captain off Cape Cod. He captained those steel-hulled nightmares that kept Lunk to the bottom without even a radio call. They made a movie called The Perfect Storm. He knew the people the characters were based on. Anyway, I'm not sure what hard times led to it, but he accepted a job to smuggle marijuana from Colombia to Boston. This was in the early 1980s, all 40,000 pounds of it. He navigated with no electronics, just an old-fashioned stant. His crew didn't speak English. At one point, he thought he was about to be caught, so he sank the boat, not realizing that marijuana floats. Bales of it started washing up on shore. He swam to land and ran away with one of the bales. Tattoos, Italian, heavy set. He reminded me of Pavarotti, but with a feminine voice. He was rugged, close to 300 pounds. He even ended up in a book written by a journalist. He had no plan to just become a criminal. It was something he got pulled into through the boating networks as a busy captain in the region. He finally got caught and did 3 years in federal prison. During that time, he got healthier. He could deadlift 900 pounds. He's the reason my siblings and I are in Maine. He passed away a couple of years ago. Rest in peace, Skip. You'd be laughing out loud at the marijuana laws today. Story 41. My uncle was a police officer in Washington State for years. He eventually became a homicide detective and spent many more years witnessing some of the darkest, most terrible things imaginable. It affected him deeply and eventually led to alcoholism and infidelity. When my aunt found out, she filed for divorce, which sent my uncle into an even deeper spiral. He lost everything: his job, his family, and his sense of stability. He tried starting over and got remarried, but his new wife constantly fought with him about money. One day he snapped. He walked into a bank and robbed it at gunpoint. A police chase followed, and he was eventually cornered. My uncle climbed out of his vehicle and took cover behind the engine, announcing to the officers that he had a gun. One officer tried to de-escalate by saying, "There's no reason for this to end in a gunfight, but if it comes down to you and me, it'll be you, because I have a newborn son to get home to." My uncle went silent for a few moments. Then he stood up, opened the car door, climbed back in, ignoring the officer's commands. He yelled out the window, "Guess it's me then," before taking his own life. Story 42. My grandfather was arrested for espionage in a Middle Eastern country sometime in the late 60s or 70s. He was a steelworks engineer, meaning he built the massive steel skeletons of buildings. At one point, he was working on a project in a country like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. I can't remember which exactly. When he finished a job, he always took photos for clients and management, documenting his work. So he's there, finished a project near an airfield, taking pictures as usual, when he's suddenly arrested and interrogated. He was confused at first. He was just photographing the site he had worked on. But it turned out that a plane belonging to a very important person, a president or royal family member, was in a hangar in the background of the photos. He got away without charges after a tense conversation. He used to tell this story like it was hilarious. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized how close he came to something truly serious. Forgive the gaps in memory. I was a kid when I was told this story, and my grandfather passed away over a decade ago. He was the kind of guy who loved to tell tall tales, but this one was confirmed by my grandmother, who definitely didn't find it as funny as he did. Story 43. My great aunt was married to a very abusive husband. She came from a deeply abusive family as well. Her father used to beat her and her brothers constantly. She started dating a guy who went to her high school. Her plan was to marry him so she could get out of the house. One night, her boyfriend and her father got into a fight at a bar. The boyfriend ended up killing her father. Despite that, they still got married. Her entire family cut off contact with her after that. Once they were married, her husband became extremely abusive. He cheated on her and treated her terribly. She eventually decided that she needed to leave and fled town. However, her husband found out where she was staying and kidnapped her. He drove her into the woods, beat her, and assaulted her. Afterwards, he pulled a gun on her. She fought back and somehow managed to get out of the car and start running. Then she heard the gun go off. He had taken his own life in the car. She's married now to a truly amazing man who treats her with love and respect. Story 44. At the age of 16, me and 4 friends decided one night to hop onto the side of a moving train. We were idiots. The train hauled gypsum rock across the country to a dock nearby to be shipped. Each train car was a large container with 8 wheels, and each one had a ladder. The wheels were fully exposed, no guards or coverings, very industrial. The train was about 100 cars long. The trick was to run beside the train, grab onto the ladder, and hop your feet up. To get off the train, you just barrel roll. My friend and I had done it before, and we wanted to show the others what we did for fun. Again, idiots. I hopped on first, then my friend. Not long after, one of the other 3 tried it, but he didn't get a running start. He grabbed the ladder from a stationary position, and the train jolted him forward and into the air, causing him to lose his grip and fall. His body still had forward motion and rolled uncontrollably underneath the train. Each passing cart occasionally tumbled his body forward and sideways. The other 2 friends watched in horror. After hearing their screams, my friend and I jumped off the train and ran back. I can't emphasize enough the level of panic. The clacking of the train was loud, but it wasn't nearly as piercing as the sound of their screams. One of our friends reached the scene before I did, dodged the train wheels, and pulled our seemingly lifeless friend to safety. The other 2 didn't move. One froze. The other sat on the ground with his head down. When I got there, my friend who rescued him called 911 while I checked on our injured friend. He was badly hurt, but still had all his limbs and was conscious, though in obvious agony. Firefighters arrived first and began emergency care. He had a few broken ribs, a broken arm, and a broken leg. Lots of bruises. The fact that he didn't lose any limbs was nothing short of a miracle. As for the 2 friends who witnessed it, I wouldn't trade places with them. They took it hard, and I don't blame them. My nightmares were bad, but I didn't see it happen. They did. The mental replay of what one could have or should have done can be brutal. I ended up getting a ticket for trespassing. And yeah, I was a complete idiot. Story 45. My grandfather was originally a foreman for lumber camps when he first came to this country. Yes, Canada. When the lumber business dried up, he started a business as a master builder. Residential, commercial, etc. He kept on his best right-hand man until the very end. This guy was a bit slower mentally, but he was a good hard worker and incredibly loyal, on the job and during Saturday drinking sessions. One Saturday, my grandfather's man got thrown in the local jail for public intoxication. He was weeping and crying so loudly that you could hear him through the ground floor window of the jail cell. My grandfather got into his truck, hooked chains to the bars on the window, and pulled them out. Then he and his man went home. Nothing came of it because his man was only being held in custody and hadn't been charged with anything. The best part? My grandfather was hired the next week to repair the jail wall and window because he was the only guy in town who could do it.